Hi everyone, this is Mempin from AdCore. I'm here for the last and final lecture for this year's lecture series in PIDC 2024. So for this one, we're going to be talking about setup and framing. So now that we know how to prep things and how to read motion strategically, it's important for us to know how to proceed from there in terms of actually constructing the world and actually talking about the context you are going to be debating in. So, in short, let's answer the question: what is setup? So, the common misconception is that motions, when they have info slides, when they have very clear comparatives in terms of what it wants you to talk about or what it doesn't want you to talk about, no longer needs any sort of further legwork from debaters. And I simply disagree. Because I think that it is our job as debaters or as first speakers specifically to set up the world in which we are debating the motion in, as opposed to just depending on the information that we are given through the info side and through the motion, or through whatever clarification you get from CAP. So, more importantly, setup refers to the framework of your case. And so, a non exhaustive list of what I think falls under your setup is firstly definitions and characterizations. So, defining the terms that are in the motion. What do we mean by ban? What do we mean by strategic ambiguity? What do we mean by supporting and stuff like that? Second is the actual framing, which I feel is your characterization of the debate. Next is your burdens and stance, and that is something that changes depending on your firstly side allocation in the debate, whether you are government or opposition, and secondly, the strategy that you want to take in terms of proving these things. And lastly, your policy or model, whether that is building a specific action or policy that you want to take, or building the world that you are going to be debating in. So let's move on to framing. So, is it just the beginning of your speech? The simple answer is yes and no, because while a lot of debaters put framing at the beginning of their speech, it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to that. Framing can go as far as bleed into your arguments and have specific parts of context and specific parts of world building that is feeding into your arguments as well. So, for the purposes of this lecture, framing refers to strategic contextualizations of the debate, so it should answer the simple question of where does the debate happen. And so when we have a motion, you're asked to focus on a specific context of the debate as opposed to something that you see as the entire world. So you have all of these moving parts happening all at once, and so the frame clarifies where specifically the debate happens then. So let's look at this example. From UADC 2022 Round 3, this House regrets Western institutions' push for market liberalization. So, given the debate and given the motion, the debate probably doesn't happen in firstly Western states that are probably already liberalized, because that probably means that there was no room for these institutions to push for that market liberalization in the first place. Or it probably doesn't happen in very protectionist contexts where Western institutions have no influence in, because that means that the push wouldn't have existed in the first place. Or lastly, it probably does not happen in countries with no capacity to liberalize their markets, because that means, regardless of whether or not there was a push, there wouldn't be any actual tangible outcomes for us to be able to debate on. So, in turn, that probably means that the debate then happens in firstly, parts of the global south that show signs of being receptive to market liberalization. So, this probably means that they are showing interest and reaching out to these Western institutions for things like aid, for things like assistance. Or that probably means that they are showing signs of underdeveloped industries that have great potential in terms of being liberalized. Or this probably happens in developing countries in general with the potential for greater extents of free trade. So that implies that they already have some level of their market being liberalized at the present. It's only going to be a greater push from these Western institutions to be able to get them to fully liberalize in turn. So, given that, let's look at another example, which is PIDC 2022 Round 7. This House believes that Self proclaimed feminists, healthcare workers, should boycott healthcare institutions which refuse to provide abortion services. So, this probably doesn't happen in states where abortion is illegal or criminalized. So, that means that whether or not we boycott these things, nothing is going to happen in terms of lobbying, nothing's going to happen in terms of like reacting to a policy. Or secondly, this probably doesn't happen in states with strong legislation that requires healthcare institutions to provide abortion services. So that probably means that it doesn't happen where there is no need for such boycott or such strong reaction from a self-proclaimed feminist and stuff like that. So that probably means that the debate happens in states where abortion is allowed or legal, but acceptance is not overwhelmingly widespread. So it probably happens in like Western liberal democracies where there's some legislation to allow it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all encompassing that all healthcare institutions are going to be mandated to follow that. So that leads us to the question of why framing matters in the first place. So if you could see in the previous two examples, just by framing and deciding where the debate happens and does not happen, we already have a vague idea of what the case is going to be looking like in terms of government and opposition and what the most important clashes of the debate are going to be. And so framing matters because it's a necessary groundwork for your case. And I mean that in three levels. Okay, maybe like four. Okay, so firstly, framing matters because the importance of your argument depend on it. So depending on context, some arguments on things like urgency, on things like principle consistency may not matter because that's not what the context calls for at that moment in time. Secondly, this probably means that when you frame the current landscape as urgent or unsalvageable, that probably means that processes and mechanizations are going to change according to the frame. So, if you're going to frame your debate in a context wherein there's a lot of heavy legislation that doesn't allow for abortion, then that also changes the way that you are probably going to have to do this boycott. You're probably going to have to do it discreetly and stuff like that so that you won't get criminalized also, you won't get red tag, you won't get cracked down on and stuff like that. So third is that the clarity of the debate depends on this. And what I mean by that is that there are some rounds wherein government will push for a certain context and opposition will push for a certain context. And neither of these teams will be doing the legwork of clarifying what exactly is the more debatable context in terms of arguing the motion and in terms of what is probably going to be the median case. Because you don't necessarily get that level of engagement in all rounds. And so, lastly, it could preemptively respond to your opponent's case. So when you frame things strategically by saying that it probably happens in a Western liberal democracy, then it probably boxes out other responses from opposition or other arguments from opposition saying that, oh, when you boycott these things, you're probably risking your own safety because there's heavy, heavy, heavy opposition from the state itself and from other institutions that prevent you from being able to act on these things and stuff like that. So, yeah, the TLDR is that it's necessary groundwork for your policy or your model. All right. So, now that we know what framing is and why it matters, what makes framing good or resilient? So, firstly, I think resilient framing has to be fair because if it breaks the debate, you probably have to scrap it. If it makes it so unbelievably unfair that your opponent can no longer make constructive arguments that is actually value adding to the discussion, then that probably means that you're not doing it right. So, next is that it has to be strategic. So, you need to answer the question, does it help preempt responses? And does it help counter arguments that may be thrown at you as accusations? And last one, is it believable? So, is it actually a plausible conceptualization of the present and visualization of the future, or are we being a bit too delusional? Are we being a bit too unrealistic? Like, don't get me wrong, I appreciate it when framing or world building is creative, but it still has to be within the realm of possibility. Otherwise, that's just no longer debatable. So, yeah, a disclaimer is that different debates require different strategies for framing. So, this lecture that I'm doing only suggests a few strategies to help improve how debaters specifically frame debates. So, this is particularly going to be helpful for first speakers who have a larger burden to firstly frame the debate, but also have a larger advantage in terms of how exactly they want to set things up and how exactly they want to start introducing things. And so, with that, I think that a good frame follows the formula of a good understanding of the motion and what it asks from you in terms of what you have to prove, in terms of what you have to consider and think about. And next is good world building, which is simply creating a clear picture of what the world looks like at that point in time, or in terms of what the world looks like when the motion asks you to reimagine it. And so I think a few questions that you might want to ask yourself when framing the debate or when building the debate is the following. So, firstly, what does the world look like? How do people interact? What institutions are present? Who has the most power or control? What is life like? So, these are just a few questions that could get you started in terms of like visualizing what the world looks like and where your frame is at that moment in time. So let's look at a few examples. So example number one, once more, is UADC 2022 Round 3. This House regrets Western institutions push for market liberalization. So let's build first what the Western institutions push for market liberalization looks like. So first question, where does the debate happen? The answer is probably in developing countries that firstly would be receptive to this sort of push, but also secondly have capacity or potential in terms of liberalizing their market. So, secondly, what kind of Western institutions are we talking about? So, this probably looks like Western institutions like the IMF, like the UN, like the US to some extent, the EU, that impose a lot of these things without necessarily going on, sorry, without necessarily going to the extent of being predatory or without necessarily going to the extent of like being pushed out by a lot of these contexts. So, lastly, what does the push then look like? So, that probably looks like conditional aid that is dependent on certain market reforms and certain trade policies being imposed for them to be able to access that sort of assistance. That probably looks like intervention and policy making through pressure. That probably looks like just a general trend within neighboring countries that would probably prompt that specific context to liberalize as well because of the fear of being locked out of any sort of like globalized benefit. So let's build the converse then. So, what does the world look like absent the push? So, that probably looks like a world or a country that is a lot more protectionist in terms of their market. It probably is heavily regulated and heavily monitored by the state as opposed to something that is open for free trade. Next, would it have been possible for these countries to liberalize without the West or without the push from the West? Possibly at a slower pace, because naturally they would still want to maintain some level of trade due to complete self sufficiency or autarky being largely impossible in the context of the world that we have right now. So, next is that who would have done this or imposed some level of dominance or some level of influence among these nations if it weren't the West? So, you could say that it's probably other actors with the power, capacity, and interest to be able to impose their own interests, their own belief, and their own framework of trade to these other contexts. So that probably looks like China as the most like plausible actor. So additionally, I think the things that you're supposed to consider when you are trying to build up the world then are these following things. So, first is institutions. So, it probably looks like governments, economies, etc. And then we have social dynamics. So, things like community building, interpersonal relationships, and other interactions. And then we have individual disposition. So that probably includes interests and priorities, your individual quality of life, your worldview, how you view things, and finally, society as a whole. In general, what are the pressures that exist, the norms, the values, what do we have agreed upon as a society? So let's move on to the next example, which is PIDC 2022 round 6. This house prefers a world where the dominant social norm is to be single. So, first, then, our institutions. What kinds of policies do we have in place in relation to single people and in relation to non single people? So, the way that you could talk about this is to say that when the dominant social norm is to be single, that probably means that a lot of our welfare services are no longer prioritizing individuals that have families or individuals that are married. That probably means that we have greater access to welfare and assistance as individual members of society. Or that probably means that we could have policies that are encouraging people to stay single and be single because that probably looks like housing, that probably looks like conditional cash transfers being much more available to single people and stuff like that. Like, it's really up to you how you think is the most strategic to build that up. Next is social dynamics. So, how do people approach relationships? How do people approach interacting with each other? So, that probably means that when we interact with other people, the priority is probably to maintain some level of platonic interaction or some level of platonic relationship, as opposed to jumping straight into going into a romantic relationship. Because at that point, the dominant social norm is to be single. That doesn't necessarily mean that dominant social norm is to isolate yourself. That probably just looks like a level of the emphasis in terms of getting into a long-term committed relationship, for example, in the romantic context. So that probably changes how you interact with people, how you meet people. There's probably less dating apps, there's probably less pressure to have to get married and stuff like that. Next, in terms of individual disposition, is the individual happy? Well, that depends on how you want to paint the individual. Are they living a solitary life because they are single, or are they largely integrated into their other social circles, such as their friends, their family, and stuff like that? And then I think a more important question to ask then is how receptive is the individual to the dominant social norm? Like, is the individual easily pressured? Is this something that they easily succumb to, anyways? So, the last question then is on society as a whole. How much is this dominant social norm imposed? Do we see it everywhere in media? Are stories probably centered on this as opposed to love songs? Is the general agreement of how things should be going to be a certain way? Is it going to be imposed on you strongly? Are people going to shame you for being in a relationship? Are people going to heavily discourage getting into a relationship and dating? What kind of systems are in place to be able to encourage or enforce this sort of dominant social norm? I think another final thing that I didn't include in this slide is questioning where the dominant social norm comes from and who created that dominant social norm. So was it prompted by any sort of like significant world event? Like, did COVID suddenly make us want to give up on relationships and stuff like that? So those are questions that help you create a stronger concept of what the world looks like. So let's move on to the next example. Oh, that should be example number 3. I'm so sorry. But more recently, we have Diliman Pre PIDC. So the motion there was this house, as a devout Catholic, would abandon the belief in the divine plan. So in terms of institutions, like, how does the church act and how does the church operate in terms of firstly imposing this belief in terms of facilitating interactions around this belief? Does it reflect in their teachings? Does it reflect in their practices and stuff like that? Like, you need to question the dynamics that exist at that context or at that institutions. Next is social dynamics. How will people interact with me once I abandon this belief? How will people I then interact with people, do I feel like I have more agency to choose and pick the people that are going to be in my life? Do I have to disclose this to other devout Catholics as well? Like, just food for thought, essentially. And the next is individual disposition. Will I feel confusion, cognitive dissonance, given that the social circles around me still probably heavily subscribe to the belief in the divine plan, as opposed to me who is already abandoning it? But also individually, what does the process of abandoning the belief in the divine plan look like? Does this look like I'm leaving the church, or am I still in the church and stuff like that? What do I want as a person and as a believer? Are those two things reconcilable or irreconcilable? Is my thirst for comfort compatible with my interests or guilt or whatever as a devout Catholic then? And then lastly, society as a whole. Am I going to be shunned? Are there other instances of people abandoning beliefs from the Catholic Church? Are there instances of people looking for other sects of Catholicism or whatever, or Christianism, that would provide me this belief and stuff like that? So I think then that world building essentially is just a process of constantly asking yourself many questions that would help you arrive at a clear understanding of what the world looks like and where the debate starts and ends. And that's how you get your frame. That's how you get some level of clarity in terms of the context of the debate. Yeah, so let's answer a few frequently asked questions. So, first, does the frame always have to be at the beginning of the speech? Generally, I think no. While it is common to find the framing at the beginning of the speech, specifically the Prime Minister's speech, it doesn't necessarily have to be a template for everyone else. You can always integrate your framing into constructive material and responsive material. So, when responding to opposition, when they try to say that the debate happens in X, Y, and Z, when you clarify where the debate actually happens, that is still part of your framing, even though it's part of your rebuttals. Next, in terms of like constructive material, when you argue in specific context and explain to the judge why the debate happens in that specific context explicitly, then that is also still part of framing. So next is, can framing only happen, or does framing only happen in the first exchange? So again, I think the answer here is no. Deputies can still add to or feed to the context of the debate. So I do caution for policies, when you are building specific policies, the prongs have to be declared as early as PMLO exchange. So whatever you try to add on at deputy, or like even worse at whip, might not be credited, because that is something that you're expected to lay out as early as the first speech of your case. So yeah, essentially that is all for framing and for setup, in terms of like being able to build the world, and in terms of being able to understand where the debate happens. And so yeah, thank you.